Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second day of Environment Virginia. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's activities and various panels. We've got another great day planned for you today, beginning with a great keynote speaker and followed by the Ursula Award. It's now my great pleasure to introduce someone who has been in the news lately trying to solve a very vexing problem in another state. So we're happy that he could make some time today to come to be our keynote speaker. I would like to introduce Dr. Marc Edwards to our forum. Dr. Edwards received his bachelor's in biophysics at SUNY Buffalo and went on to earn his master's and PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Washington. He is the Charles Lunsford Professor with the Virginia Tech Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. His areas of interest include water treatment, corrosion, arsenic removal, and applied aquatic chemistry. He has been in the news a lot lately because of the Flint, Michigan city water crisis, but really his interest in water corrosion and home plumbing goes back to the 1990s. In 2003, he was asked to investigate water and plumbing problems in Washington, D.C., where he uncovered lead leaching in the city's water supply due to the use of chloramine. I've been told that he's a very candid, don't pull his punches type of guy, and we're very honored to have him here today. I suspect that you'll be talking about his remarks as you leave here, and from my perspective, that's a good thing. As the director of the Center for Leadership and Ethics, I am pleased to introduce someone who has demonstrated ethical leadership in keeping the interests of our city, our citizens, in the forefront of his work. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Edwards to the stage.
Is this microphone working? Can you hear me on this mic? Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me, and I just wanted to come and tell this story about what happened to 100,000 American citizens in Flint, Michigan, where essentially for 2 years civilization as we know it ended for them. And this complete failure of government at all levels just doesn't happen overnight. And to give some background and some understanding of how this could come to be, we have to go back in time to about 2001 in Washington, D.C., where a similar event occurred and actually set the stage and made another Washington, D.C., Flint, Michigan, inevitable. And let me just start out by saying that what happened in Washington, D.C. in their lead and drinking water crisis in 2000-2004 is now acknowledged to be one of the world's public health tragedies. We now know that about 200 fetal deaths occurred. Lead was the first way of controlling family size about 100 years ago. If you wanted to reduce your family size, women ingested lead pills, and it induced abortion. Children were not born during that time. Hundreds of children were lead poisoned above the old CDC standard, 10 micrograms per deciliter. Of course, the other thing that makes this case interesting is that it's a watershed, because this is something no one ever thought would occur. This problem was owned from start to finish by government, science, and engineering agencies, specifically federal government agencies. In Washington, D.C., they treat the water. EPA has primacy in Washington, D.C. It's not a state. And of course, there's the D.C. Water and Sewer Authority, which sells the water to customers. But these are the environmental policemen. No one ever thought they would become the environmental criminal and do what they did in Washington, D.C. And then the other thing that makes this an interesting case study is that there's absolutely no dispute about the health harm of lead. In other tragedies, other chemicals, someone's usually speaking out, oh, maybe it's not as dangerous as we think. It's official U.S. government policy that there is no safe level of lead exposure, period. And if you as a landlord allow tenants to live in an apartment and do not disclose a lead paint risk, you can go to jail. That's the standard. If someone knows about lead exposure to another person, does not reveal that, you can go to jail. So let's just take a look at what was happening to the EPA lead and copper rule. Lead and copper rule is the only monitoring program that requires you to actually take samples in the home. And these red lines here indicate the status of lead in drinking water in Washington, D.C., and the yellow line is the EPA action level of 15 parts per billion. And as you can see, D.C. had some lead in water up until about the year 2000. And then what happened? Well, these tragedies always start with good intentions. And in D.C.'s case, they were trying to do something good. They were switching from free chlorine to chloramine disinfectant to retain disinfection, try to reduce the amount of harmful disinfection byproducts. And they immediately were sampling the Water and Sewer Authority, the local water utility in homes. 5 samples were over the EPA action level. And if they had done the legal thing, reported that to the EPA, all of Washington, D.C. would have been told their water was unsafe. Parents would have taken steps to protect their children using bottled water, filters, and flushing. But instead, they hid those results and said they were meeting the EPA standard. So that's where it started. Within a few weeks, they had an indication that there was a problem. What was happening? Well, go figure, we've been using chlorine and lead pipes for hundreds of years, and no one knew that chlorine was keeping lead on the pipe and out of the water. So this cutaway section of the lead pipe, you see that brown lead rust in there. With chlorine in the water, you can see that the lead, even at 48,000 parts per billion, is that orange color. That's good. It's insoluble. It will tend to stay on the pipe out of the water. In contrast, chloramine does not have that property. The exact same circumstance, lead starts to dissolve in the water. And that's what happened in Washington, D.C. Switch from chlorine to chloramine, the lead started to fall off the pipes. And it fell off at very, very high levels. 48,000 parts per billion is actually the highest level that was detected from a tap in Washington, D.C. at that time. That's 9 times hazardous waste, levels of lead coming out of people's taps. It was over 100 parts per billion in thousands of D.C. homes. And parents started to figure out on their own that kids were getting lead poison from water. Some of them were calling up the water company, a young engineer named Jerome Crow. He knew about the illegally invalidated samples. He told them if it was him, he would not be drinking D.C. water. He was fired. He was fired for doing the right thing. He immediately went and reported the problem to D.C. Office of Inspector General, told them about the illegally invalidated samples. They involved EPA Office of Inspector General, and during the worst lead and water contamination event in modern U.S. history, D.C. and EPA OIG said there was nothing to this whistleblower's claims. There was no problem with lead in D.C.'s water. A little bit of time goes by. The next person on the job responsible for lead in D.C.'s water was Seema Bhatt. She was being pressured to cover this up. This is 2 years after the switch occurred. She was being pressured to report that the EPA, that D.C. had lead levels were meeting the action level. And so she sent an email directly to EPA telling them we're over the action level. When her superiors saw that, they immediately started taking steps to fire her. They fired her. And I don't have time to go into all of these, the story here, but over the 12 years of the D.C. lead crisis, from 2000 through about when it was exposed in 2010, 5 people were fired for doing the right thing. for laying down their professional lives to protect the public. How were they thanked? They were fired. And in 2004, the Washington Post found out about it. Of course, people went berserk because they realized they'd been exposed to the best-known neurotoxin for 3 years without knowing about it.
Anything like that.
And Congress was angry. Lead was high in the U.S. Congress. People were asking President Bush at his press conference whether he had been drinking lead in his water. That happened twice. And the first hearing really showed how awkward the situation was for the agencies. Here's a congressman asking EPA during a hearing I was involved in March 2004 about the situation with lead in D.C. water.
Anything like this happen anyplace else in the country to this degree? I mean, is there any precedent for this?
There is a precedent, not to this degree, though, Congressman. I mean, there are instances
So this is the
throughout
worst
country.
case that's ever happened in the country in terms of the level and length of exposure to lead through the drinking water. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Staff is informing me that at Superfund sites, I mean, there are lead contamination problems.
Oh, hazardous material sites. Well, yeah.
Right. But in terms of a, yeah, well,
Yeah.
Trumbull's was quoted the next day in the Washington Post that you'd have to go to a Superfund site to find more lead than what was in D.C.'s water. And this, you know, was when I realized this is unprecedented because it was EPA's lead. EPA's regulation inadvertently caused this problem. They have primacy in Washington, D.C. And this gives you some idea on why they behaved the way they did. So just set the stage. This is late March 2004. There's 6 congressional investigations. People are out of their mind with anger. The GAO said they were going to get involved, and the mayor's response was, take a number. It's like a Soho bakery around here of people investigating us. You're going to be tripping over yourselves. Maybe that's happening. This is March 31st. And now something was going to happen that was going to prevent us from learning anything of value from this. To learn from our mistakes so that it will not happen again. That's the hope. You know, we're human. We're human. We screw things up. That's what we do. There should be a Geico commercial, right? But we have to learn. You know, we have to learn so these things are not repeated. And so all hope of that was about to come off the tracks because, and this is what I've learned over the last 12 years, when the reputation of a modern-day government agency is in conflict with the truth, something has to give, and it is always the truth. In every single case, it's always going to be the truth. And in this case, what happened was the U.S. Centers for Disease Control came into Washington, D.C., claimed that they look at the blood lead of D.C.'s residents, their children, adults, and they claimed that absolutely a miracle had occurred. Not a man, woman, or child had any evidence of elevated lead in their blood from this 3 years of unprecedented exposure to lead in drinking water. No one was hurt. And it's what everyone wanted to hear. Everyone wanted to hear that. Now, having done the congressional hearing in 2010, we now know behind the scenes this whole report was falsified to get out in time for a press conference and a Senate hearing. And when the author of that report was asked by a colleague, Henry Falk, how's it going? Mary Jean Brown, who wrote that, said, today's the first day in over a month there wasn't a story on lead and water in the Washington Post, and also the first I haven't been interviewed by at least one news outlet. I guess that means it worked. It worked. How'd it work? They shut everyone up. They covered up evidence of the harm. They prevented any chance of us from learning from this mistake. And then, incredibly, you cannot make this up, folks. The agencies who caused this environmental crime started to blame the public for what happened. Here's an example. 3 days after the CDC wrote their falsified report, in the Washington Times, someone wrote, this is a hysteria, much ado about nothing. the EPA can reasonably claim no harm, no foul. A pediatrician wrote in and said, it's amazing. We've had this living experiment in Washington, D.C., and what we learned is kids can drink any amount of lead in drinking water, and it will not hurt them. And then, again, you cannot make this stuff up. You go a year and a half into the future, the agencies start to give themselves awards. The same people that poisoned Washington, D.C., covered it up. Here's from Region 3, EPA. We're giving the D.C. Lead Response Team the Gold Medal Highest Honor Award granted by the agency for distinguished service of major significance to environmental improvement into public service. And here's the problem with unethical behavior in science and engineering. It's not even always the initial lie that causes the most damage, but it's the lies that spread and hurt people elsewhere, and that's what happened here. Here's an example. That message that children can drink any amount of lead in drinking water without being harmed was spread all over the world. In Seattle, they found hazardous waste levels of lead in kindergarten classrooms. Parents were worried. Pediatrician wrote in and said, we shouldn't be worried about this. CDC just did this great study in Washington, D.C. No one got hurt from drinking lead in water for 3 years in D.C. There's stories in Montreal, in Europe, where they cited the CDC science repeatedly to downplay lead in water dangers. And the Washington Post did this amazing story, October 2004, showing how water utilities all around the country are cheating on their lead and copper rule monitoring, and no one did anything because lead in water won't hurt him. So I saw this happening. I saw water utilities talking right in front of EPA about cheating on the lead and copper rule monitoring. EPA did nothing about it. And so I realized that this CDC study was doing all kinds of harm. So I thought, okay, I'm a scientist, they're scientists, you know. I knew it could not possibly be true. There had been dozens of peer-reviewed articles that showed kids drink high lead in drinking water, they get lead poisoned. And this piece of crap paper from CDC wiped out all of that good science, all of that human history. And so I reach out to them and I call them, I ask, can I see your data? You know, can I see your methods? They refused to return my calls or emails. I tried to show them how their study was being used to allow kids to be exposed to lead in drinking water. I submitted a FOIA, which I haven't gotten filled to the present day. I had reporters intervene and ask questions because we learned about some problems with the study. And they were told no one has a problem with our paper except an engineer with no formal training in or appreciation of public health. And I guess that's me they were referring to. I don't really remember much about the next few hours. My wife says I was really, really mad. And here, you know, these people, it's this CDC Office of Science Integrity, just start making stuff up. They start issuing press releases against the concern I'm raising, talking about science integrity is CDC's hallmark, and they take these allegations seriously. They said they investigated my complaints, found nothing to it. Congress later found out they never even asked the author of the paper a single question, not one. They just issued the press release to discredit me. This is 2009. And they thought they had me because they had the data and they claimed they couldn't give it to me because they thought it was privacy protected, right? Trust them. We're the CDC. But I found out Children's National Medical Center had about 50% of the blood leads in D.C. I harassed them unmercifully to the point where it was easier for them to give me the data and go away than to keep listening to me and telling me no. And when we got the data, it took me all of 5 minutes to figure out what everyone knew before Washington, D.C., which is if kids drink lead in their drinking water, they get lead poisoning. So we wrote this up in a peer-reviewed paper. This was 2009. It was front-page news in the Washington Post immediately because people realized that they had been lied to. But it was 5 years after the fact. 5 years before anyone knew about the harm that was done to D.C.'s population and children. 2 hours later, Carol Lenig asked the first author of the CDC paper, hey, what's the CDC statement about the paper? Mary Jean Brown said in a prepared statement that it was unfortunate their study was cited as proof of no problem. In retrospect, some people misinterpreted the intent and scope of the health consultation, including characterizing it as a scientific study, which it clearly was not. That's our CDC. So Congress issued subpoenas. They finally got the emails that CDC refused to give me. It was written up in a report that illustrated just how scientifically indefensible CDC's actions were. And you think CDC might learn from this? No. Because on the day of this hearing, they issued another falsified report that literally said their conclusion in 2004 was the opposite of what people interpreted it to be, in that they were guilty of bad writing. Seriously, it was complete Orwellian rewrite of history, no apology, no hope that CDC has learned from this mistake and that they are now worthy of the public trust. Zero. So they pretty much got reamed, but they didn't learn anything from it. In 2013, I kept working on this as a volunteer. I did this work 25, 30 hours a week from 2004 to 2013. I not only spent $500,000 I got from the MacArthur Foundation on this, but another $700,000 of my own money to show what happened in Washington, D.C., that children were not born because of this exposure. And it's incredible to me. You think, we have this system of checks and balances for industrial bad actors. I mean, can you imagine an industry causing a contamination event of this nature, how much money would be spent figuring out the harm done to the population? Do you know how much money was spent figuring out the harm to kids in D.C.? Zero. And every ounce of energy of these agencies was spent covering this problem up. Every little bit of it. No apology. Kids who got hurt in D.C. got zero. They got the shaft. And so, what's the lesson sent? What's the lesson learned here? 5 heroic actors got fired. And let's look at what happened at the government agency. So the lawsuit was initiated in 2009. Class action was thrown out in 2013 because trying to prove harm 6 years after the fact, lying is incredibly effective. There's 5 cases that might go to trial next summer. I'll believe it when I see it. But by the time these cases go to trial, the kids that were exposed 2001, 2003 are out of high school. No government official was ever fired or demoted. No one retracted the gold medal honors to EPA for what they did in D.C. Which brings us to Flint. And as I said, if we cannot learn from our mistakes, people, we're going to repeat them. And so I knew another D.C. was going to happen. But it turned out a little bit different this time. And so, as in D.C., it started out innocent enough. The water utility was switching its water source to save some money. They had a little ceremony, and they said, this is a historic step for us. It was, not quite for the reasons they thought. Because a civil servant at the State Department of Environmental Quality forgot to follow federal law and use a corrosion inhibitor. And one of the first manifestations of that was the water started to smell bad. And people thought the water was giving them rashes. And actually, this is just a few months after the switch occurred in 2014. A lot of people would not take a bath in Flint water. They were actually using bottled water to take baths, and that practice is occurring through to the present day. The second poorest city in the United States. People cannot take a bath in their water. Of course, one of the manifestations of no corrosion control is destroys the steel pipe infrastructure. The rust was falling off into the water. This is one of the heroes of Flint, Miss Leanne Walters. When she called us and figured out on her own that her child had been lead poisoned from the water exposure, we tested her water. And it not only had that iron rust in it, but it had 13,000 parts per billion lead in it, about 1,000 times the EPA action level. And we had a fight on our hands. We were joined in that fight by a heroic EPA employee, Mr. Miguel Del Toro, on his own time, went to Flint to work with Leanne to expose the problem. And he knew that writing a memo that said Flint was not following federal law was not going to be popular in the EPA. He knew he was putting his career on the line. He wrote this memo up saying that Flint was not following federal law, the entire city was in danger, and as he expected, he was retaliated against. And a few days after he wrote this memo, this is an email that came out last week, he lamented the fact that all the bad actors are being defended, the bad actions are being ignored, and people trying to do the right thing are subject to intense scrutiny. He's not happy about what he found, but he's not going to stand by and let kids be lead poisoned. This is an EPA employee. I truly, truly hate working here. EPA is a cesspool. And he wrote this after he was told that he would no longer be allowed to talk to people from Flint or about Flint. EPA worked a deal with the state that they could have their way with Flint's children. So when, and at some point you got to say they're so bad they're good, okay? And here's what I mean by that. Flint residents, second poorest city in the United States, they're paying the highest water bills in the country. Many Flint residents pay more for their water bill than for their home mortgage. And this water was not suitable for anything but flushing toilets. And there was every reason to believe at that point the water was contaminated with lead, that they were not following law. And in response to Mr. Del Toro's memo and all the complaints of the residents, the state, backed by the EPA, because silence is acquiescence at this point, Flint water is safe to drink. And even worse, after the mayor reached out to EPA chief Susan Hedman in Region 5 and asked if there's anything to this Del Toro memo, she essentially said no. And a few days later, he went on TV and said how safe it is for Flint to be drinking this water. Drink up, kids. Drink up. Let them drink lead. So I got mad again. And this time, I asked for volunteers. I said, this city's in danger. So we had 3 professors, 7 postdocs, 16 undergrads and grad students show up. And frankly, we said, not today, not on our watch. You will not have your way with these kids. We're going all in for Flint. And what we meant by that was we were going to provide the funding, the technical support, and the expertise to allow Flint residents to do the job that these agencies are paid to do, but will not do, which is test the safety of the water for lead. So we launched this in August 2015, sent sampling kits to Flint. In the meantime, we had a multi-front strategy here because we knew we were in a battle against agencies with a lot of power and money. And again, to these folks, if their reputation is at stake, you can be sure the truth is going to fall by the wayside. We made it simple enough for TV reporters to understand, so we did experiments taking steel, exposing it to the new Flint water, the old water that was in the system, and as you can see, the residents were not crazy. The corrosive water with no corrosion control put more iron into the water. We did experiments with lead solder. This is what the agency should have done. Again, Flint water on the left, Detroit water on the right. You could actually see the lead in the Flint water. That's the white stuff that you see suspended there. This is not rocket science. And to prove this, they were claiming that we couldn't be trusted with our experimental results. So I sent them at MDQ this experiment, said you can do it. And oh, by the way, I'm also sending it to a 4th grade classroom. Now, MDQ refused to do the experiment, but the 4th graders did it. They got on the news, and everyone could see exactly what was going on. The Flint water had more lead in it. And then I enlisted a truly secret weapon, and this is amazing, a brownie troop, and had them do some of the experiments the state agencies refused to do. I had them write letters to the governor and also sent those to EPA because little kids got this, folks, when these agencies didn't. So it was amazing what the citizens did. We sent out 300 bottles. They returned 90% of those kits. And it wasn't long after that, a local pediatrician looked at the blood lead in the neighborhoods where we found the highest water lead and saw that blood lead was rising, and the state finally threw in the towel. And the impossible happened. They switched back to Detroit water. They figured out a way to turn the valve on to make Detroit water go back into the system. And it wasn't long before people realized the nature of this crime in Flint, in America, and all around the world, because we poisoned kids. The agencies we paid to protect us poisoned kids in the second poorest city in the United States. And frankly, they got off on it. They got off on abusing their power. So President Obama declared a national emergency, and at that point, somewhat reassuringly, good things started to happen. More water flowed in, donated by every celebrity on the planet than Flint could use in probably 3 years. Lead testing for Flint's kids. But Flint's going to need a lot more help. Their people and pipes have been damaged. Flint has currently experienced about 100 times the main breaks of a comparably sized city because not only was the system in bad shape to start with, but putting this corrosive water into it was the last thing on earth that they needed. So this is what a commute looks like in Flint in the present day. Because of the lack of corrosion control, we also are virtually certain it triggered one of the worst outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease, waterborne, in US history. 10 people died. And, you ask yourself, what does it take to get someone fired in this country at a government agency? You've heard the old statement, oh, you're more likely to die on the job than to actually ever get fired. That's unfortunately true. But Comedy Central picked
The
this up.
saddest thing about this leak is how little it would have cost to prevent it all.
The fix was about $100 a day. All of this could have been avoided for just that small amount of money.
$100 a day. Why didn't you say something? I want to call out to all my people in Africa right now watching The Daily Show. Because my friends, for only $100 a day, we can save a village in America and get these people drinking the water that they so badly need for just the price of 5 cups of coffee in New York.
So now you're starting to cut here. I mean, because once you get on Comedy Central and you start to be an international embarrassment, you're scratching that reputation of these government agencies, right? So finally, Susan Hedman got resigned. And I was involved in 2 congressional hearings so far on this. I was involved in 2 back in 2004. One was I testified with Leanne. The other one was last month. And frankly, I have to tell you, I wish there was good news from my experience, but there's not. The state admitted their share of the blame for what happened. They're trying to get their system fixed. But the EPA sat right there and swore under oath they had nothing to do with what happened in Flint. It was not their problem at all, when EPA had everything to do with what happened in Flint. And so I can assure you that they've learned nothing. They've learned nothing from this. And so, going back to this kind of miracle, I mean, for me personally, it was really an amazing experience, as was DC. What we accomplished in 9 years in DC, we were able to accomplish in 6 weeks in Flint. And I worked with just amazing people. And here's a picture of 4 of us that were involved. And I'm not going to go into the details, but we had a communist, we had a socialist, we had a Republican, we had a renounced Catholic, Army brat, and none of that mattered. We called out everyone who got in our way because, it was all about the kids. And it was all about the injustice of what was occurring right before our eyes. And, I wish I could tell you it was easy, but it wasn't. We hardly slept. I don't know why I still have my job at Virginia Tech. I have not done my job for a whole year. But we got up every day with such a sense of purpose. And we felt like we were doing the job that we were born to do. And despite the cost, I just wish everyone in this room could experience something like that just once in their lifetime, just once. Because, as Einstein said, the world is not going to end because of evildoers. They are always there. The reason it will end is because those of us who are not evil stand around and do nothing and allow this to happen. So with that, I'll just open it up for any questions that you have. Thank you so much for listening to the story.
Good morning, Dr. Edwards. I really enjoyed your presentation, and you certainly focused in on the, say, failures and oversight at, say, the regulatory level, the state and federal level. But how would you characterize the local level and the technical operation and oversight at the plants in Washington and Flint? And is there something that can be done to maybe improve, the situation right at the very, where the rubber meets the road, so to say?
Okay. Well, so the first thing is you have to think about the overall environment, the regulatory environment that we live in. And the environment that EPA has created, largely as the result of their shame of what happened in Washington, D.C., is that anything goes when it comes to lead in drinking water. For 10 years, myself and other people in Washington, D.C. have chased down bad actors who have been cheating on lead and copper rule monitoring, falsifying reports. We show this information to EPA, and EPA does nothing. So the overriding regulatory environment is anything goes. And that trickles down to the state agency. And open the paper. Read yesterday. Huffington Post wrote, we showed Philadelphia was cheating on how they do their lead and copper rule monitoring. EPA backed them up. They're not sampling enough homes with lead pipe. In New Orleans, we showed the utility was falsifying records, literally forging signatures from residents of homes that had high lead, claiming they were dropping out of the lead and copper rule pool because they didn't want to participate anymore. Totally false. EPA did nothing about that. But yeah, if you go down to, so that all of that trickles from the top down. The city was not following the law in terms of how they were sampling lead. They did not sample enough homes with lead pipe. But that's happening all around the United States. Flint also, they were not running their system at that point. The state was running the system because Flint was bankrupt. So the state was calling all the shots. And that largely, thankfully for Flint, absolved them of responsibility. Because if they had been running that system, the only recourse for people in the city of Flint would have been to sue the city, which has no money. And everything that we saw play out in Washington, D.C. would have been 10 times worse in Flint, because in D.C. the parents are getting nothing. Go try to sue the city, okay? It's a long, hard fight. Flint would have had no money. So actually, one of the drivers here is because the state was running the system, Flint can get money from outside. Yes, sir. Okay. Okay. Okay, what has to be done first and foremost? About $300 million has been made available to help the city recover. But unfortunately, the disaster response that we have in this country is kind of a disaster for something like this. These are folks used to responding to hurricanes. And they don't know how to respond, and you can't blame them. It's a man-made infrastructure disaster. So amongst the things that we're trying to do, the things that are most important are to make sure that children get a proper health care and nutrition to mitigate the health harm from the lead exposure. Dr. Mona's work, they have a Flint Foundation that they're trying to set up. There are now food banks being available because Flint is essentially a food desert. You cannot, it's hard to get good nutrition for kids in Flint. So food trucks are now coming into town. So they are I think it's everyone under the age of 18, I think, is now covered by Medicare, free medical care. But we're also, one of the biggest challenges we have is getting their infrastructure back to the point where the city can become financially sustainable. Right now, they have the highest water bills in the country, and that will persist until we get this water main infrastructure replaced, because these water breaks, main breaks, are just incredibly expensive to repair. So we have to invest in that infrastructure, and I think the federal government, I believe, since they own part of this problem, they should be stepping up and helping the state and helping Flint get back on its feet. So it's going to be a long, complicated process. It's going to be at least 2-3 years. Yep. Yes, sir. Okay. Right. Okay, here's the thing, everybody. We are all responsible to some extent for what is happening here. When I go to Congress, there's two options being put on the table. One is give EPA more money. The other is get rid of the EPA. That's like the two options that are on the table. There's only like 20% of us in the middle who want to get EPA fixed, and frankly, that's the only option that's available. And so, first off, we definitely need to have better protections for whistleblowers. The fact that you can get fired for doing your job, you can watch porn, this is a fact, you can watch porn all day on your computer at EPA and not get fired. There's actual congressional investigations proving that. But I have seen 3 of EPA's best employees, the nicest people you will ever meet, got fired for doing their job. So there's a No Fear Act being proposed to protect EPA whistleblowers. It's incredible the protections they have to get rid of an employee. They fight it out in court. The max damage that EPA can suffer is $300,000 for destroying someone's career. They're capped, $300,000 to get rid of a good, what we would call a good apple, what they would call a bad apple. And at the end of the day, if you're getting rid of all the good people and you're keeping all the bad people, again, what do you expect? So we have to change this culture. If the only way you're going to cull the herd is when it becomes an international embarrassment and you get on Comedy Central, we're not going to make progress. So we need a cultural change, and we need to get an attitude change amongst ourselves where we're just not pointing our finger at ideological enemies and say, oh, yeah, it's your fault. We are paying a price for this. Our kids are paying a price for this. And the amazing thing about this, story is that they got caught. If we hadn't been there, they'd still be drinking that water to this day. Those kids still would have been hurt. That infrastructure would have been destroyed. And you know, you can always blame that on bad parenting, bad schools, bad local management. I guarantee you this is happening in other communities around the United States. Maybe not for lead and water, but for other contaminants. We are paying a horrible price for the corrupt culture at these agencies. We have to get this fixed. We have to get this fixed. Yes. One of the employees at the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was fired. 3 more, they're trying to get them fired, but it hasn't happened yet. So they've been trying to get them fired since about October of last year. So here we are to April. She was a political appointee, so it's easy to get rid of a political. She resigned. DC, no one got fired. Just gave each other awards, covered it up. I mean, to this day, you know, the fact is, if you don't hold these people accountable, they'll just lie to themselves, you know. I mean, to this day, they refuse to accept what happened. You know, no one ever forced them to confront the truth of what they did. So they don't believe kids got hurt. You know, and these parents still fighting the court case to this day. I mean, it's so outrageous, I cannot tell you. The water company, DC WASA, pays 12 lawyers roughly $500 an hour. They don't care how much this costs. They just raise the rates. So the parents suing are paying to fight themselves. It's incredible. No private industry would get away with this in a million years. No private industry would get away with this. Yeah.
Dr. Edwards? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm over here. It sounds like there could be a systemic problem or systematic problem with this type of situation in other cities around the country. Is there any comparable investigation being conducted by anyone to identify other places where this might be a problem? And
for sure. So if you read, just go and type lead water in Google. USA Today showed lead in water is high in school. Again, it's this attitude of anything goes. It's been going on for 10 years. Lead in water is high in thousands of schools across the country. Philadelphia is cheating. Chicago has high lead in water problems. Sebring, Ohio, Jackson, Texas. You know, pretty much every rock you turn over in a major urban center, you're going to see something slimy come out. But again, I don't, you know, lead in water is interesting as a case study. It's black, you know, it's kind of black and white here. It's representative of other problems. And so yeah, lead in water problems are a big problem across the United States, but the larger problem we have is bad science and bad science agency culture. No one ever thought that people would behave this way with no profit motive whatsoever. We have no check and balance on this, because no one ever anticipated it would happen. There's nowhere I can go. I've found 5 falsified reports in my work on DC by these agencies, where not only that CDC report, Congress could not even find the data for their report on the blood leads of the kids in DC. I've got EPA reports written with no data. And there's nowhere I can go, no authority I can go to say, hey, EPA, you cannot write a report with no data. It's incredible. So we need some checks and balances. I mean, yeah, we got to check, we got to fix the culture. I mean, but we have to put a check and balance on the power of these agencies, because they can literally rewrite human history with one lousy report, just like they did in Washington, D.C. with that Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report.
Ann Swanson with the Chesapeake Bay Commission. First of all, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. It's extraordinary what you've done. It seems to me it's a real testimony to also what the land-grant colleges can do and what their abilities to really bring science to bear. And so I'm wondering, is there any way to now foster a network of land-grant colleges around the country that are using their labs to look at this issue? Because I know in the Bay region, we have conversations all the time about those same issues in Baltimore and our other big cities, and there's no movement because of the government agencies. So I'm wondering, how do you help to create this network of land-grant colleges that can be asking these questions?
Okay. So first and foremost, I call out all of us, frankly. But in particular, I call out professors. Because I'm not very popular. I go and I speak to professors, and I tell professors that, frankly, we are the greatest generation of cowards this world has ever seen. Because we have all this freedom, and we never exercise it. We spend all of our time sucking up to government agencies for funding. You will never hear, probably in your lifetime, another professor call out EPA and CDC. And why is that? Because it's career suicide. I've destroyed every funding network I ever had, okay? And my model's not sustainable. I'm more than $1 million in debt. I paid out of my own pocket to fight the battle in DC. $250,000 is what it cost for our work in Flint. We had a GoFundMe campaign. We got half of that back. This is not sustainable. We had 6 person years of effort donated to this by this amazing team at Virginia Tech. But it had to be done, and I'll go to my grave, and we stood up for Flint's kids when no one else could or would. So no regrets. It was priceless. But yeah, I think academic institutions, we owe it to the public. And if you see that the return on investment we got, not personally, but it's extraordinary. We got $300 million for Flint. People are talking about science, corrosion control, water pollution on primetime news programs like Rachel Maddow, mostly getting it right. It's incredible. We've fed the virtuous cycle between the public and the universities, which is what you're pointing to, the land-grant model. That cycle is being destroyed because, frankly, universities aren't worthy of the public trust anymore. We're in it for ourselves now. We're operating more and more like private businesses. So yeah, there's a lot of blame to go around. Cowardice certainly applies not only to professors, but just about everyone, frankly, in today's day and age. That's one of the reasons I changed my schedule to come to VMI, because when we started our ethics program at Virginia Tech in the class on ethics and heroism, one of the models I was able to tap into and that I drew strength from was the VMI program. And it wasn't long ago in this country when we got in an armed conflict, people from all classes of life went and fought and laid down their lives. And now, what are we asking people? Yeah, we're asking you to do your job. And I know it really is lousy to get fired for doing your job. But at the end of the day, how heroic is that, really? It's a travesty that these people lay down their professional lives and are sacrificing. We don't even say thank you. No one says thank you to these people. So yeah, there's a lot of blame to go around. We all own a part of this problem that happened in Flint. We all have a responsibility to help get it fixed, and we all have a responsibility to make sure that next Flint doesn't happen.
Let's give Dr. Edwards a great
Thank you, guys were awesome. Thanks.
but more importantly from the citizens of the United States for your advocacy and, more importantly, your moral courage in helping our citizens. So on behalf of the superintendent, the staff and faculty, and the Corps of Cadets, please accept this small
thanks so
token
much.
of our
Appreciate that.
appreciation. And thank you for coming.
Thanks, Bob.